Victorian fiction and great expectations, morality, social class and realism versus sentimentality. The Victorian period was the long reign of Queen Victoria in Britain from 1837 to 1901, a time marked by massive industrial progress, expanding empire, and rapid social change that reshaped everyday life. Novelists and thinkers wrestled with difficult questions about morality, class, religion, and scientific discovery because traditional beliefs were increasingly challenged by modern urban society. Although it was an age of moral seriousness and strict social codes, it also produced some of the most imaginative literature in English, from Charles Dickens and the Brunists to Thomas Hardy, who explored the tensions between respectability and human desire. Charles Dickens is often regarded as one of the most important Victorian novelists, and Great Expectations stands as one of his most influential works. It brings many central concerns of Victorian fiction together, especially moral behavior, class identity, social mobility, and the complicated balance between realism and sentiment. The Victorian period was shaped by industrial growth, strict moral codes, social anxiety, and great inequalities. Dickens uses Pip's life to explore how ambition, wealth, guilt, childhood experience, and social pressures form a human being in Victorian society. The novel looks closely at crime, punishment, childhood innocence, adult corruption, and ideas of self-making. Through Pip's personal journey, Dickens raises questions about what makes a person truly good and what society wrongly considers important. Morality and moral growth. Victorian fiction is famous for showing characters learning moral lessons, and Great Expectations follows this pattern very clearly. Pip begins life as a lonely poor boy being raised by a strict sister and a gentle blacksmith, Joe Gargery. When Pip meets the convict Magwitch in the opening chapters, he shows early signs of basic human kindness. Although he is terrified, he still brings food to the starving man and says he feels dreadfully afraid yet also strangely sympathetic. Dickens shows right from the beginning that moral choice is usually uncertain in real life and rarely clear or simple. Pip is frightened, but still capable of feeling another person's pain, which already hints at an inner conscience. Pip later becomes ashamed of Joe, ashamed of his humble origins, and wants to become what he calls a gentleman. When he receives mysterious money and leaves for London, he allows pride to control him. He stops writing to Joe and treats his oldest friends with coldness. Later he admits, "I was haunted by the fear that I had been mean to Joe." This shows that moral awareness is not fixed, but grows through experience, guilt, and reflection. Victorian moral fiction often shows characters learning lessons by suffering, and Pip's suffering comes through painful self-reflection. When he discovers that Magwitch, the convict, is his true benefactor, his shame becomes overwhelming. Dickens uses this moment to explore real morality, suggesting that goodness is not defined by birth or social position, but by kindness, loyalty, and forgiveness. Magwitch, the criminal, becomes more generous and fatherly than many respectable figures in the novel. Dickens also highlights moral hypocrisy among upper classes. Characters like Drummle are cruel, unpleasant, and arrogant, but socially powerful. Meanwhile, Magwitch, who is a criminal in law, shows devotion and affection to Pip. The Victorian moral message becomes clear. Goodness depends on love and human sympathy, not on wealth or class. Dickens constantly reminds the reader that society rewards the wrong values, Christian conscience, and forgiveness. Victorian morality was influenced by Christian thinking. Dickens does not preach directly, yet the novel emphasizes forgiveness, compassion, and charity. Joe forgives Pip easily and says you and me was ever friends. Joe never stops being kind even when Pip behaves badly. His gentle love acts as a moral center, teaching that moral goodness is based on simple acts of humanity more than social reputation. Herbert Pocket, another good character, teaches Pip patience, friendship, self-control, and politeness without arrogance. Dickens contrasts these virtues with the cruelty of Mrs. Joe and the coldness of Estella, who warns Pip honestly, "Have no heart." By the end, Pip learns true humility, which Victorian readers would recognize as moral growth. He confesses his wrong ideas, apologizes to Joe, and finally works honestly. The conclusion suggests maturity comes through self-knowledge and responsibility. Social class and ambition. One major concern in Victorian fiction, the rigid class system. Society is divided between the poor, the working class, the middle class, and the wealthy. Dickens uses Pip's journey to explore how class shapes identity. Pip begins as a village boy raised in poverty. He dreams of escaping his background, believing that becoming a gentleman will give him dignity and happiness. Estella and Miss Havisham represent the world of wealth that Pip wishes to enter. Miss Havisham speaks to him in a way that encourages shame, telling him that common boys are coarse. Pip begins to believe her and becomes deeply unhappy about his simple upbringing. Dickens shows how society creates artificial desire for high-class identity and teaches people to despise their origins. When Pip receives money from Mag-Witch, he assumes that Miss Havisham, a wealthy lady, must be the source. This already exposes his prejudice. He has learnt society's values so deeply that he cannot imagine a convict might possess wealth or generosity. Dickens challenges Victorian class assumptions by revealing Mag-Witch as the true benefactor, turning the entire class logic upside down. It is the poor criminal who empowers Pip, not the wealthy aristocrat. This twist questions the whole Victorian belief that social advancement equals moral improvement. Dickens also exposes the emptiness of London's social life. Pip becomes caught in debt, fashion, expensive tastes, and the desire to impress others. These ambitions bring no real happiness. He becomes discontented and sick at heart. The novel shows how class ambition destroys natural relationships, especially his loyalty to Joe. In contrast, Joe remains modest and happy with simple, honest work, proving that moral worth is separate from social status. Women and class position. Female characters also express class issues. Estella is raised to be attractive, but emotionally cold, designed to break men's hearts. She says, "I have been bent and broken." Miss Havisham uses Estella as a weapon against men. Dickens uses this as a social warning, showing how wealthy environments sometimes produce emotional damage instead of happiness. Biddy, on the other hand, is kind, simple, and patient, yet Pip overlooks her because he is still chasing class dreams. Dickens uses these female images to show the false standards of Victorian culture, which values style over kindness and wealth over human feeling. Victorian fiction and great expectations. Morality, social class, and realism versus sentimentality. The Victorian period was the long reign of Queen Victoria in Britain from 1837 to 1901, a time marked by massive industrial progress, expanding empire, and rapid social change that reshaped everyday life. Novelists and thinkers wrestled with difficult questions about morality, class, religion, and scientific discovery because traditional beliefs were increasingly challenged by modern urban society. Although it was an age of moral seriousness and strict social codes, it also produced some of the most imaginative literature in English, from Charles Dickens and the Brownies to Thomas Hardy, who explored the tensions between respectability and human desire. Charles Dickens is often regarded as one of the most important Victorian novelists, and Great Expectations stands as one of his most influential works. It brings many central concerns of Victorian fiction together, especially moral behavior, class identity, social mobility, and the complicated balance between realism and sentiment. The Victorian period was shaped by industrial growth, strict moral codes, social anxiety, and great inequalities. Dickens uses Pip's life to explore how ambition, wealth, guilt, childhood experience, and social pressures form a human being in Victorian society. The novel looks closely at crime, punishment, childhood innocence, adult corruption, and ideas of self-making. Through Pip's personal journey, Dickens raises questions about what makes a person truly good and what society wrongly considers important. Morality and moral growth. Victorian fiction is famous for showing characters learning moral lessons, and Great Expectations follows this pattern very clearly. Pip begins life as a lonely poor boy being raised by a strict sister and a gentle blacksmith, Joe Gargery. When Pip meets the convict Magwitch in the opening chapters, he shows early signs of basic human kindness. Although he is terrified, he still brings food to the starving man and says he feels dreadfully afraid yet also strangely sympathetic. Dickens shows right from the beginning that moral choice is usually uncertain in real life and rarely clear or simple. Pip is frightened, but still capable of feeling another person's pain, which already hints at an inner conscience. Pip later becomes ashamed of Joe, ashamed of his humble origins, and wants to become what he calls a gentleman. When he receives mysterious money and leaves for London, he allows pride to control him. He stops writing to Joe and treats his oldest friends with coldness. Later he admits, "I was haunted by the fear that I had been mean to Joe." This shows that moral awareness is not fixed, but grows through experience, guilt, and reflection. Victorian moral fiction often shows characters learning lessons by suffering, and Pip's suffering comes through painful self-reflection. When he discovers that Magwitch, the convict, is his true benefactor, his shame becomes overwhelming. Dickens uses this moment to explore real morality, suggesting that goodness is not defined by birth or social position, but by kindness, loyalty, and forgiveness. Magwitch, the criminal, becomes more generous and fatherly than many respectable figures in the novel. Dickens also highlights moral hypocrisy among upper classes. Characters like Drummle are cruel, unpleasant, and arrogant, but socially powerful. Meanwhile, Magwitch, who is a criminal in law, shows devotion and affection to Pip. The Victorian moral message becomes clear. Goodness depends on love and human sympathy, not on wealth or class. Dickens constantly reminds the reader that society rewards the wrong values, Christian conscience, and forgiveness. Victorian morality was influenced by Christian thinking. Dickens does not preach directly, yet the novel emphasizes forgiveness, compassion, and charity. Joe forgives Pip easily and says you and me was ever friends. Joe never stops being kind even when Pip behaves badly. His gentle love acts as a moral center, teaching that moral goodness is based on simple acts of humanity more than social reputation. Herbert Pocket, another good character, teaches Pip patience, friendship, self-control, and politeness without arrogance. Dickens contrasts these virtues with the cruelty of Mrs. Joe and the coldness of Estella, who warns Pip honestly, "Have no heart." By the end, Pip learns true humility, which Victorian readers would recognize as moral growth. He confesses his wrong ideas, apologizes to Joe, and finally works honestly. The conclusion suggests maturity comes through self-knowledge and responsibility. Social class and ambition. One major concern in Victorian fiction, the rigid class system. Society is divided between the poor, the working class, the middle class, and the wealthy. Dickens uses Pip's journey to explore how class shapes identity. Pip begins as a village boy raised in poverty. He dreams of escaping his background, believing that becoming a gentleman will give him dignity and happiness. Estella and Miss Havisham represent the world of wealth that Pip wishes to enter. Miss Havisham speaks to him in a way that encourages shame, telling him that common boys are coarse. Pip begins to believe her and becomes deeply unhappy about his simple upbringing. Dickens shows how society creates artificial desire for high-class identity and teaches people to despise their origins. When Pip receives money from Magwitch, he assumes that Miss Havisham, a wealthy lady, must be the source. This already exposes his prejudice. He has learnt society's values so deeply that he cannot imagine a convict might possess wealth or generosity. Dickens challenges Victorian class assumptions by revealing Magwitch as the true benefactor, turning the entire class logic upside down. It is the poor criminal who empowers Pip, not the wealthy aristocrat. This twist questions the whole Victorian belief that social advancement equals moral improvement. Dickens also exposes the emptiness of London's social life. Pip becomes caught in debt, fashion, expensive tastes, and the desire to impress others. These ambitions bring no real happiness. He becomes discontented and sick at heart. The novel shows how class ambition destroys natural relationships, especially his loyalty to Joe. In contrast, Joe remains modest and happy with simple, honest work, proving that moral worth is separate from social status. Women and class position. Female characters also express class issues. Estella is raised to be attractive, but emotionally cold, designed to break men's hearts. She says, "I have been bent and broken." Miss Havisham uses Estella as a weapon against men. Dickens uses this as a social warning, showing how wealthy environments sometimes produce emotional damage instead of happiness. Biddy, on the other hand, is kind, simple, and patient, yet Pip overlooks her because he is still chasing class dreams. Dickens uses these female images to show the false standards of Victorian culture, which values style over kindness and wealth over human feeling. Christmas dinner is an agonizing affair for Pip, who is crowded into a corner of the table by his well-to-do Uncle Pumblechook and the church clerk. Mr. Wopsle, terrified that his sneaking out of the house to help the convict will be discovered. Pip nearly panics when Pumblechook asks for the brandy and finds the bottle filled with tar water. His panic increases when, suddenly, several police officers burst into the house with a pair of handcuffs. Pip is sure that the policemen have come to arrest him, but all they want is for Joe to fix their handcuffs. The bumbling policemen tell Pip and Joe that they are searching for a pair of escaped convicts, and the two agree to participate in the manhunt. Seeing the policemen, Pip feels a strange surge of worrying for his convict. After a long hunt, the two convicts are discovered together, fighting furiously with one another in the marsh. Cornered and captured, Pip's convict protects Pip by claiming to have stolen the food and file himself. The convict is taken away to a prison ship and out of Pip's life, so Pip believes forever. Joe carries Pip home, and they finish their Christmas dinner. Pip sleepily heads to bed while Joe narrates the scene of the capture to Mrs. Joe and the guests. Pip continues to feel powerfully guilty about the incident, not on his sister's account, but because he has not told the whole truth to Joe. After the incident, some time passes. Pip lives with his guilty secret and struggles to learn reading and writing at Mrs. Wopsle's school. At school, Pip befriends Biddy, the granddaughter of the teacher. One day, Joe and Pip sit talking. The illiterate Joe admires a piece of writing Pip has just done. Suddenly, Mrs. Joe bursts in with Pumblechook. Highly self-satisfied, they reveal that Pumblechook has arranged for Pip to go play at the house of Miss Havisham, a rich spinster who lives nearby. Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook hope she will make Pip's fortune, and they plan to send him home with Pumblechook before he goes to Miss Havisham's the next day. The boy is given a rough bath, dressed in his suit, and taken away by Pumblechook. Over breakfast the next morning, Pumblechook sternly grills Pip on multiplication problems. At 10, he is taken to Miss Havisham's manor, Satis house. The gate is locked, and a small, very beautiful girl comes to open it. She is rude to Pumblechook and sends him away when she takes Pip inside. She leads him through the ornate, dark mansion to Miss Havisham's candle-lit room, where the skeletal old woman waits by her mirror, wearing a faded wedding dress, surrounded by clocks stopped at 20 minutes to 9. The girl leaves, and Miss Havisham orders Pip to play. He tells her earnestly that he is too affected by the newness and grandeur of the house to play. Miss Havisham forces him to call for the girl, whose name is Estella. Estella returns, and Miss Havisham orders her to play cards with Pip. Estella is cold and insulting, criticizing Pip's low social class and his unrefined manners. Miss Havisham is morbidly delighted to see that Pip is none the less taken with the girl. Pip cries when he leaves Satis house. When Pip returns home, he lies to Joe, Mrs. Joe, and Pumblechook about his experience at Satis house, inventing a wild story in which Estella feeds him cake, and for immense dogs fight over veal cutlet from a silver basket. He feels guilty for lying to Joe and tells him the truth in the smithy later that day. Joe, who is astonished to find out that Pip has lied, advises Pip to keep company with his own class for the present and tells him that he can succeed someday only if he takes an honest path. Pip resolves to remember Joe's words, but that night, As he lies in bed, he can't help but imagine how common Estella would find Joe, and he falls into a reverie about the grandeur of his hours at Satis House. Pip continues to suffer through his schooling, but a new desire for education and social standing makes him agree to take extra lessons from his sensible friend Biddy. Later the same day, when Pip goes to the pub to bring Joe home, he sees a mysterious stranger stirring his drink with the same file Pip stole for the convict. The stranger gives Pip £2, which Pip later gives to Mrs. Joe. He continues to worry that his aid to the convict will be discovered. Not long after his encounter with the mysterious man in the pub, Pip is taken back to Miss Havisham's, where he is paraded in front of a group of fawning, insincere relatives visiting the dowager on her birthday. He encounters a large, dark man on the stairs, who criticizes him. He again plays cards with Estella, then goes to the garden, where he is asked to fight by a pale young gentleman. Pip knocks the young gentleman down, and Estella allows him to give her a kiss on the cheek. He returns home, ashamed that Estella looks down on him. Pip worries that he will be punished for fighting, but the incident goes unmentioned during his next visit to Miss Havisham's. He continues to visit regularly for the next several months, pushing Miss Havisham around in her wheelchair, relishing his time with Estella and becoming increasingly hopeful that Miss Havisham means to raise him from his low social standing and give him a gentleman's fortune. Because he is preoccupied with his hopes, he fails to notice that Miss Havisham encourages Estella to torment him, whispering "break their hearts" in her ear. Partially because of his elevated hopes for his own social standing, Pip begins to grow apart from his family, confiding in Biddy instead of Joe and often feeling ashamed that Joe is common. One day at Satis House, Miss Havisham offers to help with the papers that would officially make Pip Joe's apprentice, and Pip is devastated to realize that she never meant to make him a gentleman. Joe visits Satis House to complete Pip's apprenticeship papers. With his rough speech and crude appearance, he seems horribly out of place in the Gothic mansion. Estella laughs at him and at Pip. Miss Havisham gives Pip a gift of £25, and Pip and Joe go to town hall to confirm the apprenticeship. Joe and Mrs. Joe take Pip out to celebrate with Pumblechook and Mr. Wopsle, but Pip is surly and angry, keenly disappointed by this turn in his life. Time passes as Pip begins working in Joe's forge. The boy slowly becomes an adolescent. He hates working as Joe's apprentice, but out of consideration for Joe's goodness, he keeps his feelings to himself. As he works, he thinks he sees Estella's face mocking him in the forge, and he longs for Satis House. Pip still tries hard to read and expand his knowledge, and on Sundays, he also tries to teach Joe to read. One Sunday, Pip tries to persuade Joe that he needs to visit Miss Havisham, but Joe again advises him to stay away. However, his advice sounds confused, and Pip resolves to do as he pleases. Joe's forge worker, Dolge Orlick, makes Pip's life even less pleasant. Orlick is vicious, oafish, and hateful, and he treats Pip cruelly. When Pip was still a young child, Orlick frightened him by convincing him that the devil lived in a corner of the forge. One day, Mrs. Joe complains about Orlick taking a holiday, and she and Orlick launch into a shouting match. Mrs. Joe gleefully calls on Joe to defend her honor, and Joe quickly defeats Orlick in the fight. Mrs. Joe faints from excitement. Pip visits Miss Havisham and learns that Estella has been sent abroad. Dejected, he allows Wopsle to take him to Pumblechook's for the evening, where they pass the time reading from a play. On the way home, Pip sees Orlick in the shadows and hears guns fire from the prison ships. When he arrives home, he learns that Mrs. Joe has been attacked and is now a brain-damaged invalid. Pip's old guilt resurfaces when he learns that convicts, more specifically, convicts with leg irons that have been filed through are suspected of the attack on his sister. The detectives who come from London to solve the crime are bumblers, and the identity of the attacker remains undiscovered. Mrs. Joe, who is now unable to talk, begins to draw the letter T on her slate over and over, which Pip guesses represents a hammer. From this, Biddy deduces that she is referring to Orlick. Orlick is called in to see Mrs. Joe, and Pip expects her to denounce him as her attacker. Instead, she seems eager to please Orlick and often calls for him in subsequent days by drawing a T on her slate. Biddy moves in to help nurse Mrs. Joe. Pip visits Satis' house again and notices how bleak it is without Estella. He walks with Biddy on Sunday and confides to her his dissatisfaction with his place in life. Although he seems to be attracted to Biddy, he tells her the secret of his love for Estella. When Biddy advises him to stay away from Estella, Pip is angry with her, but he still becomes very jealous when Orlick begins trying to flirt with her. At the pub one evening, Pip sits in a crowd listening to Wopsle read the story of a murder trial from a newspaper. A stranger begins questioning Wopsle about the legal details of the case. Pip recognizes him as the large, dark man he met on the stairs at Miss Havisham's in Chapter 11. The stranger introduces himself as the lawyer Jaggers, and he goes home with Pip and Joe. Here, he explains that Pip will soon inherit a large fortune. His education as a gentleman will begin immediately. Pip will move to London and become a gentleman, he says, but the person who is giving him the fortune wishes to remain secret. Pip can never know the name of his benefactor. Pip's fondest wish has been realized, and he assumes that his benefactor must be Miss Havisham after all. He first met Jaggers at her house, and his tutor will be Matthew Pocket, her cousin. Joe seems deflated and sad to be losing Pip, and he refuses Jaggers' condescending offer of money. Biddy is also sad, but Pip adopts a snobbish attitude and thinks himself too good for his surroundings. Still, when Pip sees Joe and Biddy quietly talking together that night, he feels sorry to be leaving them. Pip's snobbery is back in the morning, however, as he allows the tailor to grovel over him when he goes in for a new suit of clothes. Pip even allows Pumblechook to take him out to dinner and ingratiate himself. He tries to comfort Joe, but his attempt is obviously forced, and Biddy criticizes him for it. Preparing to leave for London, he visits Miss Havisham one last time. Based on her excitement and knowledge of the details of his situation, Pip feels even more certain that she is his anonymous benefactor. After a final night at Joe's house, Pip leaves for London in the morning, suddenly full of regret for having behaved so snobbishly toward the people who love him most. Jaggers takes Pip to London, where the country boy is amazed and displeased by the stench and the thronging crowds in such areas as Smithfield. Jaggers seems to be an important and powerful man. Hordes of people wait outside his office, muttering his name among themselves. Pip meets Jaggers' cynical, wry clerk, Wemmick. Wemmick introduces Pip to Herbert Pocket, the son of Pip's tutor, with whom Pip will spend the night. Herbert and Pip take an immediate liking to one another. Herbert is cheerful and open, and Pip feels that his easy good nature is a contrast to his own awkward diffidence. Whereas Pip's fortune has been made for him, Herbert is an impoverished gentleman who hopes to become a shipping merchant. They realize, surprised, that they have met before. Herbert is the pale young gentleman whom Pip fought in the garden at Satis' house. Pip asks Herbert to help him learn to be a gentleman, and, after a feast, the two agree to live together. Herbert subtly corrects Pip's poor table manners, gives him the nickname Handel, and tells him the whole story of Miss Havisham. When she was young, her family fortune was misused by her unruly half-brother, and she fell in love with and agreed to marry a man from a lower social class than her own. This man convinced her to buy her half-brother's share of the family brewery, which he wanted to run, for a huge price. But on their wedding day, the man never appeared, instead sending a note, which Miss Havisham received at 20 minutes to 9, the time at which she later stopped all her clocks. It was assumed that Miss Havisham's lover was in league with her half-brother, and that they split the profits from the brewery sale. At some later point, Miss Havisham adopted Estella, but Herbert does not know when or where. The next day, Pip visits the unpleasant commercial world of the Royal Exchange before going to Matthew Pocket's house to be tutored and to have dinner. The Pockets' home is a bustling, chaotic place where the servants run the show. Matthew is absent-minded but kind, and his wife is socially ambitious but not well-born. The children are being raised by the nurse. Pip's fellow students are a strange pair. Bentley Drummle, a future baronet, is oafish and unpleasant, and a young man named Startup is soft and delicate. At dinner, Pip concentrates on his table manners and observes the peculiarities of the Pockets' social lives. Pip returns to Jaggers's office in order to arrange to share rooms with Herbert. There Pip befriends the lively Wemmick, who invites him to dinner. Pip sees Jaggers in the courtroom, where he is a potent and menacing force, frightening even the judge with his thundering speeches. Pip continues to get to know his fellow students and the Pockets, attending dinners at both Wemmick's and Jaggers's. Wemmick's house is like something out of a dream. An absurd castle in Walworth that he shares with his aged parent. Pip observes that Wemmick seems to have a new personality when he enters his home. While he is cynical and dry at work, at home he seems jovial and merry. By contrast, Jaggers's house is oppressive and dark, shared only with a gloomy housekeeper, Molly. Pip's fellow students attend the dinner at Jaggers's with Pip, and Drummle quarrel over a loan Drummle ungratefully borrowed from Startup. Jaggers warns Pip to stay away from Drummle, though the lawyer claims to like the disagreeable young man himself. Joe comes to visit Pip in London, because Pip worries that Joe will disapprove of his opulent lifestyle and that Drummle will look down on him because of Joe. Joe's visit is strained and awkward. He tries to tell Pip the news from home. Wopsle, for instance, has become an actor, but Pip acts annoyed with him until Joe mentions that Estella has returned to Satis House and that she wishes to see Pip. Pip suddenly feels more kindly toward Joe, but the blacksmith leaves before Pip can improve his behavior. Hoping to see Estella and to apologize to Joe, Pip travels home, forced to share a coach with a pair of convicts, one of whom is the mysterious stranger who gave Pip money in the pub. Though this man does not recognize Pip, Pip overhears him explaining that the convict Pip helped that long ago night in the marshes had asked him to deliver the money to Pip. Pip is so terrified by his memory of that night that he gets off the coach at its first stop within the town limits. When he arrives at his hotel, he reads a notice in a newspaper, from which he learns that Pumblechook is taking credit for his rise in status. When he travels to Satis House the next day, Pip pictures himself as a triumphant knight riding to rescue Lady Estella from an evil castle. He encounters Orlick, now Miss Havisham's porter, at the gate. When he sees Estella, he is stunned. She has become a ravishing young woman. Despite his newfound fortune, Pip feels horribly inadequate around her, as unworthy and clumsy as ever. Miss Havisham goads him on, snapping at him to continue to love Estella. Pip walks with Estella in the garden, but she treats him with indifference, and he becomes upset. Pip realizes that she reminds him of someone, but he can't place the resemblance. Back inside, he discovers Jaggers there and feels oppressed by the lawyer's heavy presence. The next day, Pip tells Jaggers about Orlick's past, and Jaggers fires the man from Miss Havisham's employ. Pip is mocked by the tailor's apprentice as he walks down the street. He returns in low spirits to London, where Herbert tries to cheer him up, though he also tries to convince him that, even if Miss Havisham is his secret benefactor, she does not intend for him to marry Estella. Herbert confesses to Pip that he, too, is in love and, in fact, has a fiancée named Clara, but he is too poor to marry her. Pip and Herbert go to the theater, where Wopsle plays a ridiculous Hamlet. Pip takes the hapless actor out to dinner following the play, but his mood remains sour. Pip receives a note from Estella, ordering him to meet her at a London train station. He arrives very early and encounters Wemmick, who takes him on a brief tour of the miserable grounds of Newgate Prison. Pip feels uncomfortable in the dismal surroundings, but Wemmick is oddly at home, even introducing Pip to a man who has been sentenced to death by hanging. When Pip meets Estella, he is again troubled by her resemblance to someone he can't place. She treats Pip arrogantly, but sends him into ecstatic joy when she refers to their instructions, which makes him feel as though they are destined to be married. After he escorts her through the gaslit London night to the house at which she is staying, he returns to the Pockets' home. Pip feels terribly guilty for his snobbish treatment of Joe and Biddy, and he feels as though his degenerate lifestyle has been a bad influence on Herbert. The two young men catalog their debts, but they are interrupted by a letter carrying the news that Mrs. Joe has died. Pip is surprised by the intensity of his sadness about his sister's death. He returns home at once for the funeral. He meets Pumblechook, who continues to fawn over him irritatingly. He tries to mend his relations with Joe and Biddy. Biddy is skeptical of his pledges to visit more often. Pip says goodbye to them the next morning, truly intending to visit more often, and walks away into the mist. Pip's 21st birthday finally arrives, meaning that he is an adult and will begin to receive a regular income from his fortune rather than having to go to Jaggers to access his money. He feels a great sense of excitement because he hopes that his entrance into adulthood will cause Jaggers to tell him the identity of his mysterious benefactor. Despite Herbert's warning, he feels increasingly certain that it is Miss Havisham and that she means for him to marry Estella. But during their interview, Jaggers is cold and brief. He reveals nothing about the source of Pip's fortune, simply telling him that his income will be £500 a year and refusing to take responsibility for the outcome. For some reason, the encounter reminds Pip of his meeting with the convict in the graveyard so many years before. Still, Pip invites Jaggers to participate in his birthday dinner, but Jaggers' oppressive presence makes the evening less enjoyable for Pip and Herbert. Upon receiving his income, Pip decides to help Herbert by buying Herbert's way into the merchant business. He asks Wemmick for advice. At Jaggers' office in Chapter 36, Wemmick cynically advises Pip not to help Herbert, but later, at the castle, where Pip also meets Wemmick's girlfriend, Miss Skiffins, he jovially offers exactly the opposite advice and agrees to help Pip with the scheme. They find a merchant in need of a young partner, and Pip buys Herbert the partnership. Everything is all arranged anonymously, so that Herbert, like Pip, does not know the identity of his benefactor. Pip spends a great deal of time with Estella in the house of her London hostess, Mrs. Branley. However, he is not treated as a serious suitor. Rather, he is allowed to accompany Estella everywhere she goes, watching her treat her other suitors cruelly, while being more or less ignored himself. He cannot understand why Miss Havisham does not announce the details of their engagement, in which he continues to believe. Pip and Estella go to visit the old woman, and Pip observes for the first time a combative relationship between her and Estella. Miss Havisham goads Estella on to break men's hearts, but Estella treats Miss Havisham as coldly she treats her suitors. Shortly thereafter, Pip learns to his horror that Drummle is courting Estella. He confronts Estella about the news, but she refuses to take his concern seriously, reminding Pip that he is the only suitor she doesn't try to deceive and entrap. But this only makes Pip feel less important to her. That night, the young man imagines his fate as a heavy stone slab hanging over his head, about to fall. Time passes, and Pip is now 23. One night, during a midnight thunderstorm, he hears heavy footsteps trudging up his stairs. An old sailor enters Pip's apartment, and Pip treats him nervously and haughtily before recognizing him. It is Pip's convict, the same man who terrorized him in the cemetery and on the marsh when he was a little boy. Horrified, Pip learns the truth of his situation. The convict went to Australia, where he worked in sheep ranching and earned a huge fortune. Moved by Pip's kindness to him on the marsh, he arranged to use his wealth to make Pip a gentleman. The convict, not Miss Havisham, is Pip's secret benefactor. Pip is not meant to marry Estella at all. With a crestfallen heart, Pip hears that the convict is even now on the run from the law, and that if he is caught, he could be put to death. Pip realizes that though the convict's story has plunged him into despair, it is his duty to help his benefactor. He feeds him and gives him Herbert's bed for the night, since Herbert is away. Terrified of his new situation, Pip looks in on the convict, who is sleeping with a pistol on his pillow, and then locks the doors and falls asleep. He awakes at 5 o'clock in the morning to a dark sky tormented by wind and rain. In the morning, Pip trips over a shadowy man crouching on his staircase. He runs to fetch the watchman, but when they return the man is gone. Pip turns his attention to the convict, who gives his name as Abel Magwitch. To keep the servants from learning the truth, Pip decides to call Magwitch Uncle Provis, an alias Magwitch made up for himself on the ship from Australia to England. Pip arranges a disguise and calls on Jaggers to confirm Magwitch's story. Magwitch tramps around the apartment, embarrassing Pip, his gentleman, with his bad table manners and rough speech. After 5 days of enduring his guest, Pip is forced to confront his problem head-on when Herbert returns home. Magwitch leaves, and Herbert and Pip discuss the situation, agreeing that Pip should no longer use Magwitch's money. They plan for Pip to take Magwitch abroad, where he will be safe from the police, before parting ways with him. The next morning, Magwitch tells the young man his story. He was an orphan child and lived a life of crime out of necessity. His earliest memory is of stealing turnips to feed himself. As a young man, he met a gentleman criminal named Compeyson and fell under his power. Compeyson had already driven another accomplice, Arthur, into alcohol and madness. Arthur, Magwitch says, was driven to despair by the memory of a wealthy woman he and Compeyson had once victimized. Magwitch remembers a woman from his own past and becomes distraught, but he does not tell Herbert and Pip about her. He continues, saying that when he and Compeyson were caught, Compeyson turned on him, using his gentleman's manners to obtain a light sentence at the trial. Magwitch wanted revenge, and Compeyson was the man Pip saw him struggling with that night on the marsh. At this point, Herbert passes Pip a note that tangles the situation even further. The note reveals that Arthur was Miss Havisham's half-brother. Compeyson was the man who stood her up on their wedding day. Ashamed that his rise to social prominence is owed to such a coarse, low-born man, Pip feels that he must leave Estella forever. After an unpleasant encounter with Drummle at the inn, he travels to Satis House to see Miss Havisham and Estella one final time. Miss Havisham admits that she knowingly allowed him to believe she was his benefactor, and she agrees to help Herbert now that Pip can no longer use his own fortune. Pip finally tells Estella he loves her, but she coldly replies that she never deceived him into thinking she shared his feelings. She announces that she has decided to marry Drummle. Surprisingly, Miss Havisham seems to pity Pip. Upset beyond words, Pip walks the whole way back to London. At a gate close to his home, a night porter gives him a note from Wemmick, reading "Don't go home." Afraid, Pip spends a night at a seedy inn called the Hummums. The next day, Pip finds Wemmick, who explains that he has learned through Jaggers' office that Compeyson is pursuing Magwitch. He says that Herbert has hidden Magwitch at Clara's house, and Pip leaves at once to go there. Upon arriving, he finds that Clara's father is a drunken ogre and feels glad that he has helped Clara and Herbert escape him. He finds Magwitch upstairs and is surprised by the concern he now feels for the old convict's safety. He even shields Magwitch from the news of Compeyson's reappearance. Herbert and Pip discuss a plan to sneak Magwitch away on the river, and Pip begins to consider staying with his benefactor even after their escape. Pip buys a rowboat, keeping a nervous watch for the dark figure searching for Magwitch. Pip anxiously waits for Wemmick's signal to transport Magwitch downriver. Despite his softening attitude toward the convict, he feels morally obligated to refuse to spend any more of Magwitch's money, and his debts pile up. He realizes that Estella's marriage to Drummle must have taken place by now, but he intentionally avoids learning more about it. All of his worries are for Magwitch. Pip goes to the theater to forget his troubles. After the performance, Wopsle tells Pip that in the audience behind him was one of the convicts from the battle on the marsh so many years ago. Pip tries to question Wopsle calmly, but inside he is terrified, realizing that Compeyson must be shadowing him. Pip rushes home to tell Herbert and Wemmick. Jaggers invites Pip to dinner, where he gives the young man a note from Miss Havisham. When Jaggers mentions Estella's marriage shortly after Jaggers' housekeeper Molly walks in, Pip realizes that Molly, the person he couldn't place, the person Estella mysteriously resembles. He realizes at once that Molly must be Estella's mother. Walking home with Wemmick after the dinner, Pip questions his friend about Molly, and he learns that she was accused of killing a woman over her common-law husband and of murdering her little daughter to hurt him. Pip feels certain that Estella is that lost daughter. Pip visits Miss Havisham, who feels unbearably guilty for having caused Estella to break his heart. Sobbing, she clings to Pip's feet, pleading with him to forgive her. He acts kindly toward her, then goes for a walk in the garden. There, he has a morbid fantasy that Miss Havisham is dead. He looks up at her window just in time to see her bend over the fire and go up in a column of flame, rushing in to save her. Pip sweeps the ancient wedding feast from her table and smothers the flames with the tablecloth. Miss Havisham lives, but she becomes an invalid, a shadow of her former self. Pip stays with her after the doctors have departed. Early the next morning, he leaves her in the care of her servants and returns to London. Pip himself was badly burned trying to save Miss Havisham, and while Herbert changes his bandages, they agree that they have both grown fonder of Magwitch. Herbert tells Pip the part of Magwitch's story that the convict originally left out, the story of the woman in his past. The story matches that of Jaggers' housekeeper, Molly. Magwitch, therefore, is Molly's former common-law husband and Estella's father. Pip is seized by a feverish conviction to learn the whole truth. He visits Jaggers and manages to shock the lawyer by proclaiming that he knows the truth of Estella's parentage. Pip cannot convince Jaggers to divulge any information, however, until he appeals to Wemmick's human, kind side, the side that until now Wemmick has never shown in the office. Jaggers is so surprised and pleased to learn that Wemmick has a pleasant side that he confirms that Estella is Molly's daughter, though he didn't know Magwitch's role in the story. Pip leaves to finish the task of securing Herbert's partnership. He learns that Herbert is to be transferred to the Middle East, and Herbert fantasizes about escorting Clara to the land of Arabian Nights. A message from Wemmick arrives, indicating that they should be ready to move Magwitch in 2 days. But Pip also finds an anonymous note threatening Uncle Provis, demanding that Pip travel to the marshes in secret. Pip travels to the inn near his childhood home, where he is reminded of how badly he has neglected Joe since he became a gentleman. Of all his losses, Pip thinks he regrets the loss of Joe's friendship the most. That night, humbled and with an arm injured from the fire, he heads out to the mysterious meeting on the marshes. After Magwitch's death, Pip falls into a feverish illness. He is also arrested for debt and nearly carted away to prison. He is spared only because of his extreme ill health. He experiences wild hallucinations, reliving scenes with Orlick and Miss Havisham and continually seeing Joe's face. But the last is not a hallucination. Joe really has come, and he nurses Pip through his illness. As Pip recovers, Joe tells him the news from home. Miss Havisham has died, wisely distributing her fortune among the pockets. After failing to kill Pip, Orlick robbed Pumblechook, and he since has been caught and put in jail. And Joe has news about himself. Biddy has helped him learn how to read and write. Pip and Joe go on a Sunday outing, just as they used to do when Pip was a boy. But when Pip tries to tell Joe the story of Magwitch, Joe refuses to listen, not wanting to revisit painful memories. Despite Pip's renewed affection, living in London makes Joe increasingly unhappy, and one morning Pip finds him gone. Before leaving, he does Pip one last good turn, paying off all of Pip's debts. Pip rushes home to reconcile with Joe and decides to marry Biddy when he gets there. When Pip arrives at his childhood home, he finds Satis' house pulled apart in preparation for an auction. Pumblechook tracks him down at his hotel and treats him condescendingly, but Pip rudely takes his leave and goes to find Biddy and Joe. Biddy's schoolhouse is empty, as is Joe's smithy. When Pip finds them, he is shocked to discover that they have been married. Despite his disappointed expectation of marriage to Biddy, he expresses happiness for them and decides to take the job with Herbert. 11 years later, Pip returns to England. He says he has learned to work hard and is content with the modest living he makes in the mercantile firm. He goes to visit Joe and Biddy and tries to convince Biddy that he has resigned himself to being a bachelor. Pip then goes to Satis' house and finds that it is no longer standing. In a silvery mist, Pip walks through the overgrown, ruined garden and thinks of Estella. He has heard that she was unhappy with Drummle, but that Drummle has recently died. As the moon rises, Pip finds Estella wandering through the old garden. They discuss the past fondly. As the mists rise, they leave the garden hand in hand. Pip believes, never to part again.